I'm joined by our good friend Salim Mansur, Professor Emeritus at the University of Western Ontario. Good day, Salim.
Good day, Robert.
I know from our previous discussions, both public and private, that we both grew up loving the United States of America for what it stood for. It's a nation created to protect the inalienable rights of the individual, and the first nation to explicitly do so. Our attitudes towards America were shaped not only by the history books, but by the rose-tinted attitudes of Hollywood and the television programs airing from New York City. Recent events have given us both a sobering and more mature look at that great nation. While we still admire the spirit of '76 and celebrate the Declaration of Independence on this July 4th, which is the date that you and I are having this discussion, we've reluctantly come to realize that there is a sinister underbelly to the land of the free. 60 years ago, President John F. Kennedy delivered his peace speech. In it, I believe we see both the hope for the future we felt growing up in the shadow of that great nation, and likewise perhaps the naivete that would eventually end Kennedy's life months later and usher in decades of American imperialistic war efforts throughout the globe via their military-industrial complex and what became known as the deep state. So today I would like us to revisit Kennedy's historic speech and remark on how such a man as John F. Kennedy would become perhaps the single most pivotal man in modern world history, and why his sentiments made during that great speech should give us pause about the way the world is treating Russia in its current conflict, with America and NATO being played out by proxy in Ukraine. And just to put it in context, and we have to understand this, that Kennedy's speech was given at a time when many thought that the world was going to be embroiled in a nuclear war. It was delivered not long after the Cuban Missile Crisis, October of '62. But today, we are again under the threat, believe it or not, of a nuclear war. But God help us, we do not have a John F. Kennedy in the Oval Office. We have the likes of the usurper, Joe Biden, perhaps one of the most despicable presidents our good neighbors have ever come to endure. So, Salim, what are your impressions looking back on John F. Kennedy's peace speech?
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Yes, you're absolutely on the mark when you bring forth John Kennedy's speech that he gave on June 10th, 1963, as a commencement address at the American University. By the way, I published an essay on my Substack, so you might be able to refer that in.
I'll put a link just above our heads here.
Correct. The title of my essay is "Blessed Are the Peacemakers Recalling JFK." So yes, that speech was, in a sense, now looking back, possibly the most important speech that JFK gave during his first term in office, that was cut short by his murder in November 1963. And it was a speech that many historians now who have written about Kennedy, and I too agree with it, that this was the inflection point in Kennedy's relationship with the American intelligence agencies, the premier one, CIA, and the military-industrial complex. Kennedy's life ended because Kennedy came into a very serious conflict with the three power blocks within America. He enraged those three power blocks by his actions. And this speech was the inflection point. The three power blocks were the American CIA and the MIC, military-industrial complex. I'll speak about that. the organized crime syndicate in America, the mafia, and Israel and Israel's American lobby. The last one, people don't want to talk about it too much. It is, in a sense, brushed aside or not discussed in depth. Those who have discussed it, their books are not readily available. Those historians have been shunned and censored. The other two, the CIA and the military-industrial complex, is the one that is openly now talked about. As you know, Tucker Carlson, in one of his monologues, directly and openly stated what many have known or understood, that it was the murder of President Kennedy. Behind that murder was the CIA and the military-industrial complex. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is now running, Kennedy's nephew, John Kennedy's nephew, son of Robert F. Kennedy, who also was assassinated in 1968, is now running for the nomination of the Democratic Party. In a sense, he's challenging Joe Biden for the presidency in the Democratic Party. He has spoken out recently very openly about the role of the CIA and the military-industrial complex in the murder of his uncle, the president. So yes, I mean, the speech, and once we get to analyze the speech or look at the speech, we'll see how far-reaching, how much, in a sense, ahead of his time, John F. K. was in delivering that speech. And then that speech became the instrument that brought about the negotiation with Soviet Union Premier Khrushchev, President Kennedy's Soviet partner on the other side, a negotiation that led to the first major treaty between the two nuclear superpowers, the Limited Test Ban Treaty of September 1963. So yes, the speech is very important. It lays down the president's thinking, his administration's thinking about how to proceed. President Kennedy was looking forward to, this is 1963, he was looking forward to running in 1964 for his second term. And we will never know what he would have done in the second term, but in the first term, with this speech, he laid down the groundwork of what he called ending the conflict with Soviet Union, that is beginning the nuclear disarmament, and thereby ending the Cold War that had begun immediately after the end of World War II in 1945. The ally Soviet Union, that indeed was instrumental in defeating the Third Reich, Hitler's Germany. Most book talks about America defeating Germany, but it was Russia, it was Soviet Union that defeated Germany in effect. Without the Soviet army, possibly it would have been delayed, or there would have been a bigger price to pay by the Allied power, that is Britain and United States, to defeat Germany. Well, in a flip of a switch, Soviet Union then became the opponent, the adversary, and the Cold War began. So yeah, this is what we need to examine.
There's a part in his speech, Salim, that I'd like to address, and that is, I alluded to it before, and that is the naivete of Kennedy. Let me just read a passage from his speech that put it into context. He says, "It is discouraging to read a recent authoritative Soviet text on military strategy and find on page after page wholly baseless and incredible claims, such as the allegation that, quote, American imperialist circles are preparing to unleash different types of wars, that there is a very real threat of a preventative war being unleashed by American imperialists against the Soviet Union, and that the political aims of the American imperialists are to enslave economically and politically the European and other capitalist countries and to achieve world domination by means of aggressive wars. And then Kennedy went on to say, America's weapons are non-provocative, carefully controlled, designed to deter, and capable of selective use. Our military forces are committed to peace and disciplined in self-restraint. Our diplomats are instructed to avoid unnecessary irritants and purely rhetorical hostility. Now, at the time, I would have believed that wholly. You know, he gave that speech, I was just a baby. You were probably about 10 years old. But of course, we grew up with the United States that we knew at the time, which was, we thought, a benevolent, virtuous nation, founded on principles that we would both agree with, the defense of inalienable individual rights. And so we would have taken that and say, yes, of course, the actions that the United States are doing overseas and throughout the world are reactions to threats to that virtuous nation. Now, of course, in hindsight, and especially today with the proxy war in the Ukraine, and as history is unfolded and we find out about the deep state and the military-industrial complex more and more, I have to say that what Kennedy said there was naive, and naive to the point that it actually got him killed because he didn't realize the threat. Now, this is not to diminish, of course, from John F. Kennedy's greatness or the greatness of that particular speech, which was a speech of peace. And I would never expect an American president to come out and say, we're a warmongering nation, you know, of belligerents. Of course, he couldn't say that. So perhaps he could have to say that we're only using our weapons, you know, in matters of peace. But, you know, there was the Vietnam War. There were so many other incursions throughout the world. They're endless. There's a list of them on many pages on the internet, lists of them, and the number of people who have died. Why? Not because the United States was attacked by any of these nations, but because of economic reasons, oil, threats, you know, other responsibilities to protect and other things like that, you know, with the United Nations. And so what do you think of what I would say is the ignorance or naivete of John F. Kennedy in that regard?
Well, the part of the passage that you have read from his speech about the Soviet perception or perspective of the United States, you know, that's what he's talking about. That the Soviet text on military strategy find page after page wholly baseless and incredible claim, you know, such as you read, the allegation that American imperial circles are preparing to unleash different types of wars and so on and so forth, you know. So he lays down the Soviet perspective. There has been a crisis. The speech is being delivered in 1963, 7 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So let's put it in context, you know. 7 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the 13 days in October 1962, what was the lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis, you know? And that's the lesson when this, the proxy war, US-led proxy war against the Russian Federation began in 2022. What I pointed out in some of my writings, and also I think we did a few discussion on that matter, that on the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the two most powerful nuclear nations, United States and Russian Federation, as the successor state to the Soviet Union, are edging towards a war which has all the potential of a nuclear war breaking out, escalating to that level, you know, which is what 60 years earlier in the Cuban Missile Crisis, President John F. Kennedy and his counterpart Khrushchev came eye to eye, so to speak, you know, that October, and then avoided the escalation. Soviet Union withdrew from the quarantine around Cuba that President Kennedy administration had put together after the discovery that the Soviets had a place or were building missile emplacement in Cuba, and that they would then put in nuclear warheads on the missile, and Soviet missile with nuclear capability would be 90 miles away from the American heartland. And so that led to the crisis, when President Kennedy said that this has to be removed, and so on and so forth. And it was eventually removed. But in the midst of that removal of missiles from Cuba, the Soviet missiles from Cuba, it was also agreed by President, which was not given the same broadcast at the same time, that America would remove the missiles from Turkey on the borders of Soviet Union. Right. So a few months later, the American missiles were removed from Turkey. Nuclear missiles were removed from. So that's the context. 7 months earlier, and then 5 months later, he was killed. President Kennedy was killed. So one has to examine what he is saying. I would also further add that President Kennedy grew in office, and the Cuban Missile Crisis was the event that led to that growth in the president, that developed.
It has been said, especially like somebody like Jeffrey Sachs, that his first 2 years as president were nothing, ineffective,
Well, the president came to office with a very narrow win, right, over the Republican nominee and candidate who was the vice president during the Eisenhower administration, that is Richard Nixon, in the 1960 election, November 1960. It was a very narrow win, and there are allegations that win was engineered in Illinois by the Chicago mayor Richard Daley. That means the vote was rigged. Those are the allegations. So it was a very narrow win. John F. Kennedy was the youngest president elected in 1960. He was in his early 40s. He was 42 years old or something like that, going on to 43. He had served as a senator, congressman and senator, before he ran for the nomination of the Democratic Party in 1960. So he was a very young man. And he was, during that time, when he was in the Senate, and then when he was running for the office in the 1960 election, he was very much a man who could be called a military hawk. That was to balance off the other side. The previous candidate, the Democratic candidate in the 2 elections that was lost to the Republican Dwight Eisenhower, that is Adlai Stevenson, was known to be a United Nations man, a peace man, and so on and so forth. And he had lost, because part of the argument was the weakness of the Democratic Party on the issue of defense. I mean, that's been one of the Achilles heel of the charge by the Republicans or by the conservatives in America, that the Democrats have been weak on issues of defense. There was a whole history after the war in 1945 that emerged under President Truman, the previous Democratic president, who lost China. And the whole, Joe McCarthy affair, about the weakness of the Democrats and the penetration in Washington, in the highest offices, in the State Department, in the Pentagon, in the Treasury, and so on, of people suspected of being Soviet fifth columnists, people like Alger Hiss, Theodore Dexter White, and others. So that was the background. And in that background, one has to be able to understand the position on which President, or that time Senator Kennedy, came out seeking his office. And he had to, in a sense, that is, his team had to neutralize the criticism of the Republicans. The Republican president, the outgoing president, was a war hero. He was a 5-star general, the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe, President Dwight Eisenhower, or General Eisenhower, and President Dwight Eisenhower, a man in that sense, as a military man, with almost an impeccable record in terms of his place in American politics. He had served President Roosevelt, and then he had served Eisenhower had served President Truman, He had been the supreme commander after the war, or when NATO was created. He was the first supreme commander of NATO. So, and Nixon was his vice president. So here was now Nixon, the nominee, and Kennedy's team and Kennedy had to at least neutralize the argument that Kennedy would be soft on the communists, soft on the Soviet Union. And then in 1959, you had the Cuban Revolution. Cuba was a domestic issue. It was not simply a foreign policy issue. It became a domestic issue with Cuban emigre, leaving Cuba, rushing into America. The entire organized crime that had its interests in Cuba got, thrown out of Cuba after the revolution, who came into America and so on and so forth. So that is a very important domestic factor in terms of whether President Kennedy or whether Senator Kennedy would be strong enough to deal with the world that is divided between communists and the free world led by United States of America. So in that election campaign, one of the issues that President Kennedy ran with, or Senator Kennedy ran with, and charged the Eisenhower administration with, was the missile gap, that America had not done enough to build up its own military weaponry and so on to deal with the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union had taken the lead. In 1958, with the Sputnik, Soviet Union has shown that, it's rocketry, and now it is going into space. So all of that is at play. And it is in that context that one must read the line that you have read in this speech, is that President Kennedy is not turning soft. He's still strong. He understands the position, and he's speaking as the leader of the free world. He has come out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He has negotiated with Khrushchev. The Soviets withdrew their missiles, and secretly, Kennedy agreed that the American missiles would be withdrawn from Turkey. So given that context, I would say to you, and there is also a personal element, but I would say to you that it is not that Kennedy is being naive. It's Kennedy came in this confrontation as that moment in which he realized how close America and Soviet Union had come to what he describes just a few sentences ahead, that whatever we have built up together in this world can be turned into ashes in 24 hours, So that is the context. On the personal side is the fact that Kennedy is also a war hero. Kennedy was a naval man, and Kennedy had fought in the Pacific. And his story was turned into a book, into a movie, and so on and so forth. PT-109, of which he was the commander, that had been run and sunk by a Japanese frigate or a destroyer in the Pacific. one of the island in the Bikini Island in the Pacific. So he was a war hero. He was a naval commander. And this is an important factor in terms of psychologically understanding the man and putting him in context. His father had been an America First person, just Joe Kennedy Sr., who has supported Neville Chamberlain during his prime ministership in England when Joe Kennedy was sent by Franklin Roosevelt as the US ambassador to Britain, to London in 1938. He had supported Neville Chamberlain's views on appeasement. Appeasement was seen as a very positive idea in the 1930s. Nobody wanted to go to war again in less than 20 years after World War I that had devastated Europe. And
just as a short interjection here, Salim, I found it's interesting that in his peace speech, he does say, not merely peace in our time, to quote Neville Chamberlain, but peace for all time. So I wonder if that's a little dig at his father. I don't know.
Yeah, well, a dig at his father, maybe you can read that. But the point I'm driving at is he came to office, or when he ran for the presidency, there was a cloud over his head that his father was an appeaser. And would the son be an appeaser?
Well, he addresses that quite deftly in his speech as well, where he says, for we can seek a relaxation of tensions without relaxing our guard. And for our part, we do not need to use threats to prove we are resolute. So he says that several times in several ways during his speech.
So that's what I'm drawing out, Robert, because you and I are reading the speech, and your audience, our audience, whoever pays attention to us, 60 years later, we don't have the capacity to know of history 60 minutes before time.
Oh, that's true. And when I characterize some Kennedy's speech as maybe being a little naive, it is only in hindsight.
Yeah.
He does not know about a George Herbert Walker Bush or a George W. Bush or the conflicts that will happen 60 years later. He doesn't know any of that. Right. He's only privy to what has happened in his lifetime. And certainly it is perhaps the last gasp of the promise of a peaceful United States that he's trying to express, which just several months later would be turned on its head and the world would never be the same.
Yeah, absolutely. But you know, we are looking back, we are trying to understand, and we are looking at this whole situation, not only in the context that this year, 2023, is the 60th anniversary of the assassination of JFK, the murder of JFK. But this year is also where 60 years after the assassination of Kennedy, the threat of a nuclear war is right in front of our face. The war that is going on, a proxy war that is going on in Ukraine against the Russian Federation. If you again, you go back to the speech and you look at the speech, at one point, President Kennedy says that among all the great powers of the world, I'll have to find that line, but he points out, among all the great powers in the world, America and Russia has never fought a war, right? So that was 60 years ago. In fact, not that America and Russia had never fought a war. America and Russia had been allies.
Yes.
In what is considered the greatest war of 20th century by Americans, by Europeans, by Canadians, because this is the good war that Canada, America, Britain, and the Commonwealth countries fought against Germany. Well, yes, if this is a good war, who was your ally? Soviet Union, Russia. That's been forgotten. But in 1963, when Kennedy was giving this speech, none of that was forgotten, because this was absolutely proximate. He was dealing with the issue, you know. He was dealing with all of the issue that is around. But there's the other factor. I'm contextualizing this. as a consequence of the portion that you read, and I want to go into other portion, which is much more important. But in the context of what you brought out, the other thing is very important, that the most important speech until that moment when Kennedy gives this speech, the commencement address in June 10, 1963. And by the way, the speech is so important, and yet the American press basically wrote it off. Within a couple of days, the speech was gone from headline. Nobody
Well,
was.
he says, perhaps to that point, he says in his speech that peace is not as dramatic as war. And what sells papers? Peace doesn't sell papers.
Exactly. So the speech was lost, the speech was brushed away. However, this speech was given great prominence in Soviet Union. Khrushchev,
They played it in its entirety.
it was read in its entirety. The speech was broadcast on the radio and television network without being censored. So it was an opposite reaction. So the most important speech before this speech of June 30th was the speech that was given by President Eisenhower on the last day of his second term, just before he left the White House in 1961, January 17, 1961. Just
Industrial complex.
Of John F. Kennedy as the new incoming president. He would be the 35th president. Eisenhower was the 34th president. What was the speech that Eisenhower gave? That was the speech about the military-industrial complex. He warned the American people to be aware of what is happening to their country, and he laid it out. That speech should be read in conjunction with this speech, and so President Kennedy is aware of that speech. That's the military-industrial complex. And who's warning America about the military-industrial complex? That your republic is under threat, that your republic might be taken away from you, is a man who was the leader of the American or the Allied forces in the Second World War, the supreme commander, the five-star general, right? And here President Kennedy is coming in. So again, that's the context. And so what does he lay out? Just before the passage that you read, President Kennedy says, each of these passages can be quoted at length, right at the outset, he says, I have chosen this time and place. He's telling the students, he's telling the audience, I've chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth is too rarely perceived. Yet it is the most important topic on earth, world peace. And then he carries on, world peace, 7 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis that could have turned into a nuclear war, a nuclear exchange between the two military superpowers.
What he said, what he continues with, actually, I found really profound.
Yes.
Is that he's not talking about a peace in some sort of unrealistic, what we have come to know, say like a kumbaya type of peacenik, hippie type of peace, which is totally foreign to human nature, really. And he says, what kind of peace do I mean? What kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I'm talking about a genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes the life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow into hope and build a life for their children. Not merely a peace for Americans, but for peace for all men and women. Not peace in our time, but peace for all time. So he's very much a realist. He understands the reality of human nature. And that came through, I think, in my reading of it.
So let's hold that for a moment. That's exactly the passage, or one of the passages that we needed to focus on. That sentence, not the Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not a Pax Americana. In other words, where we are today, 60 years later, rule-based order, American unipolarity, American hegemony. 900 military bases around the world. America will impose everything on the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Right? And President John F. Kennedy saying, no, not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war. A peace negotiated under the United Nations by equal powers, each side recognizing. He goes on to say, I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary rational end of rational men.
Yes. Wonderful words.
It's not kumbaya.
Yeah.
This is the peace of necessary rational end of rational men. In the very next passage, this to me is one of the most striking features. He was the first president who said it, and no president since then. He was the 35th president. We are Biden now, the 46th president. So there have been 10 presidents since John F. Kennedy. None have said it, what he said. Let me read it to you. I mean, it's the very next passage. Some say that it is useless to speak of world peace or world law or world disarmament, and that it will be useless until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. This is the opposite of what you read in the beginning, where he talks about what the Soviets think about America as an imperialist country. So here are the Americans or the free world saying we can't have peace unless the Soviet Union have a more enlightened mind. In other words, the Soviet Union become like us,
More to that point, Salim, and remember, this was played in its entirety in the Soviet Union, yes, who had massive control over censorship. They played that, an American president saying that they are not enlightened. And he also said earlier on, with such a peace, there will still be quarrels and conflicting interests as there are within families and nations. World peace, like community peace, does not require that each man love his neighbor. That's the kumbaya stuff. No, it only requires that we live together in mutual tolerance. That's a more rational thing. But as he also insults, in a way, the communism of the Soviet Union, earlier on, let me see if I can find it here. Yes, here we are. We find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. This was played in the Soviet Union, and not only that, this is contextual. He's not just saying, let's have peace with Russia because these are people too. We're all human beings, right? This is a conflict between ideologies in that. He's saying that, look, I recognize that your system of government is not like our system of government. To us, your system of government, communism, is repugnant. This is what he says, it's repugnant. So, however, he's saying we can still have peace with you. No, but I'm going to imply that it's not our job to change your system of government.
Yeah, it leads to the whole notion of what would become peaceful coexistence.
Yeah,
peaceful coexistence. But what you need to read, what needs to be brought out in the passage that we were reading, I was reading to you. He says, I hope they do. They have a more enlightened attitude. I believe we can help them to do it. And here is the clincher. But I also believe that we must re-examine our own attitudes as individuals and as a nation. For our attitude is as essential as theirs. And every graduate of this school, every thoughtful citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace, should begin by looking inward, by examining his own attitude toward the possibilities of peace, toward the Soviet Union, toward the course of the Cold War, and toward freedom and peace here at home.
Can you imagine a Joe Biden saying that?
In my view, no president has ever spoken as John F. Kennedy speaking here. That is, we need to examine ourselves too.
Yeah. It's a very enlightened and mature way of looking at the conflict. It's a very, it's not an us versus them. It's like, well, let's step up to 30,000 feet and see what's going on here, right? and let's try to find a way to peacefully coexist. And as I just said, I mean, can a Joe Biden do that? I mean, the United States is not technically at war with Russia at the moment. Do you think Biden could come out and say, or Zelensky, you know, or even Putin come out and say, let's just relax here for a minute and let's look at the common person, you know, and what do they want? They don't want this nonsense. Let's look at ourselves and say, where are we wrong on this? And I find it unfathomable that a Joe Biden would do that. He's such an evil man.
But it is not only Joe Biden. As I said to you, President Kennedy was the 35th president. Joe Biden is the 46th president. Now, if you want to run all the names after Kennedy, you know, from Johnson to Biden, you have people like Reagan. Remember Reagan calling out the evil empire,
yes.
You know, Carter, Afghanistan war, on and on and on. The demonization of the other. The demonization of the other means that you cannot talk to the other as a human being. If I or whoever is a man with horns, then how can you speak to me? Or how can I speak to you? Because in the very next passage, President Kennedy is saying, our problems are man-made. There it is. Therefore, they can be solved by man. And man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human being. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. In other words, President Kennedy is recognizing officially to the world, in front of the world. She's speaking to the Americans in American University, but he's the president, leader of the free world. And in front of the world, he's extending his hand to the Soviet people as human beings and recognizing the other as human being. Our is a man-made problem. We together can solve our problem. The other side, I mean, on this issue, but again, in the larger context, which I have pointed out in my essay, Blessed Are the Peacemakers, this speech that President Kennedy gave on June the 10th, 1963, was exactly a week after the death of Pope John the 23rd on June 3rd, 1963. Now remember, Kennedy is the first Catholic president. That was another chip, beside the fact that his father was an appeaser. He was a Catholic running. No Catholic had ever won the nomination and gone ahead to become the president. You know, he had to deal with that issue in an America that was still a vast country, majority vast country. You know, this is before the open border, immigration, migration, multiculturalism, wokeism, and all of that has come down the pipeline. You know, America is white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant country. And he's the first Catholic president. He does not refer to John the 23rd. He doesn't talk about it. But it is in my imagination, in my construction, which I go into in my essay. The fact of the matter is, we can, by drawing the connection, John F. K. was very much impressed by John the 23rd. John the 23rd is possibly the key pope in the 20th century who inaugurates Vatican II and tries to open up, as people like Hans Kung has written, open up the church from the medieval mindset of the earlier popes to the modern reality of the world, you know, and so coexistence and talking with others and so on and so forth. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, John the 23rd became, you know, so concerned. He saw the dangers. He understood the danger of a nuclear war. And he did not remain, as the current Pope has remained, on the sideline. He put his office into play to bring the two sides together, to open up a discussion. He sent his emissary to Moscow to speak to Khrushchev and to Washington to speak to Kennedy. Who was his emissary? A man by the name of Norman Cousin, an American Catholic who was the editor-in-chief of the Saturday Review, which was possibly the most well-read and most circulated weekly magazine in America at that time, like the Life magazine, the Time magazine, Saturday Review, Norman Cousin. And John F. Kennedy, according to his biographers, immediately got hold of Norman Cousin, and Norman Cousin became the back channel between John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev, you see. So there is that other unstated reality of the presence of, during this crisis, the Cuban crisis, of John the 23rd, and then President Kennedy speaking, giving the speech a week after John the 23rd had died. So we need to keep, again, context. We need to keep that context in mind. The first Catholic president, the role of John the 23rd, and the emissary that John the 23rd brought together or sent out to represent him with Khrushchev and Kennedy became Kennedy's backhand channel to Khrushchev, as they traded letters, private letters. So yeah, this is extremely important. Continuing that, no precedent before Kennedy said what Kennedy, in the speech, what Kennedy said. Let me read to you a couple of sentences. He says, "No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find, as you pointed out, as Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. Repugnant." And then he says, "But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture and in acts of courage." This is at the height of the Cold War, 7 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the demonization of the Soviet Union and the Russian people, which is exactly what is going on right now, the Russophobia. And John F. Kennedy is trying to humanize, trying to educate the American people, trying to tell them we have to look inside ourselves. We have to examine ourselves. No people are devoid of goodness, lacking in virtue. And then he goes on to say, almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other. In fact, about the context, it was Russians, Tsar Alexander II, who sent the Russian fleet to the Atlantic coast and to the Pacific coast during the Civil War to defend American Union, the Union of America, United States of America, against the European powers who were trying to take advantage to split America, particularly Britain. Again, that's been forgotten. So almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other. And no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union suffered in the course of the Second World War.
He recognizes that. That's amazing, yeah.
At least 20 million lost their lives. Today we know it was much more than 20 million. But President Kennedy speaking in 1963, 20 million lost their life. Countless millions of homes and farms were burned or sacked. A third of the nation's territory, including nearly 2/3 of its industrial base, was turned into a wasteland, a loss equivalent to the devastation of this country east of Chicago. Just imagine that. From Chicago to the Atlantic coast, America destroyed. But America was untouched in the Second World War. America was untouched in the First World War. except for Hawaii, the Pearl Harbor. That is, mainland America did not get touched by the wars. But Soviet Union, 20 million people dead, half the country destroyed, and so on and so forth. Which American president, we can ask, has spoken out so clearly, so with so much empathy and understanding as John F. K. did on this occasion? I would say that John F. K. here characterized that almost epic virtue of a soldier. It is a soldier who recognizes the other soldier as a human being. It is the chicken hawks, the armchair soldiers, who demonizes the other.
It's almost childish, isn't it? It becomes name calling. If you think about it, during the Second World War, our side had names for our enemies. I won't go into all of them here, but for example, Kraut, just to objectify the enemy. And what did we do to the people, the civilians in this country, the Japanese and the Germans in this country during the war, the Chinese earlier on? We demonized them, we enslaved them, we put them in camps. And today, even today, while putting people in camps is certainly not the visual that they want to portray, what do? We prevent Russians from competing in sports. We freeze their bank accounts. Well, we freeze our own bank accounts in this bloody country, but we freeze their bank accounts of people we call oligarchs, And again, it's a demonization. Nothing that Putin, we don't hear anything that Putin says. We don't see it in the media. I've been watching Putin speak. I've been going to the Kremlin website. I've been reading his speeches. And he comes across as a very rational, patriotic man who he thinks, whether you like this or not, our listeners agree with this or not, he believes that he's doing right by the Russians, ethnic Russians in the Donbass. He reached out for peace. At least 3 times they met in Turkey with their Ukrainian counterparts. But who were the people to tell Zelensky and Ukraine not to have peace? America, Britain, NATO. We're the ones, we're now the warmongers. We are no longer peacemakers.
Yes, absolutely. So you can see, this speech is unique, given by a man who came to understand the other. And as I said in my opening remarks, President grew in the office. He grew in the office because the burden of the office made him rethink everything in terms of war and peace, which is the most important task of a leader of a country, especially in the nuclear age. He understood, as I would argue, that there can be no just war in the nuclear age. The idea of a just war, we are right, they're wrong, going all the way back to the Crusades. This is not possible anymore. Or, this has been, in a sense, to talk about a just war in a nuclear age is to talk about mutual assured destruction. That is mad. It is what Robert Oppenheimer, the director of the Manhattan Project, the American physicist, wrote a few years earlier in a major foreign affairs article where he described the situation of nuclear armed country at that time. When he was writing, the nuclear armed countries were just United States, Soviet Union. Britain had acquired a nuclear weapon in, I think it was in 1955, and then subsequently France would get its own nuclear weapon in the 1960s. China had not yet gotten the nuclear weapon. That would come after John F. Kennedy's assassination. So at the time that Kennedy was speaking in June of 1963, the speech, there were only 4 nuclear armed countries. And one of the concerns that Kennedy had was about nuclear proliferation. And that leads to the issue of Kennedy falling, as I said, the three major power blocks falling foul of the power blocks, and that was Israel and the Israel-American lobby, because Kennedy wanted to know about the Israeli Dimona project. He was aware that the Israelis were making their own secret efforts to acquire a nuclear weapon, and he wanted to, prevent that from happening. He wanted, because that was one of the part of the negotiation with the Soviet Union, to begin the nuclear disarmament. First, you have to stop what he achieved doing, that is getting a limited test ban on nuclear testing, atmospheric testing. And that happened in September of 1963, when what he had proposed, an initial with Khrushchev, was voted at the Senate. And by an overwhelming majority, 80 to 19 votes, 80 yes to 19 nays, the Senate passed the treaty and adopted the treaty. That was a huge political victory for Kennedy, but also in retrospect, it was his death sentence, because this was the beginning of the end that Kennedy was working towards, the Cold War, that with the ending the nuclear disarmament, stopping nuclear production, putting limits on it, and going down the road to nuclear disarmament, which required also ending nuclear proliferation. That would be the end of, in a sense, the Cold War. That would, the raison d'etre of the military-industrial complex would be taken away, So that treaty, ironically, looking back in retrospect, was his own death sentence that happened. But nobody at that time, that is, I'm talking about the public, the world, understood what President Kennedy had come to understand, and his counterpart in the Soviet Union, that is Khrushchev, had come to understand, because they were the ones who had come face to face, eyeball to eyeball, on the question of nuclear war, and then they pulled apart and they worked towards coming to an understanding, which is where President Kennedy showed his tremendous maturity. Just again, put the age in context, he's still a very young man. He was not even 46 when he died, when he was murdered. So, he was 45 and so on. Nobody has come forth ever since to reach out to the other in the manner in which Kennedy was laying the ground to reach out. And that's where, if you look back and we look at the present situation of how far derailed America has become. In fact, what America has become, I would argue that the warning President Eisenhower gave about the military-industrial complex, which President Kennedy lived through and died as a consequence of, has morphed into the deep state, which is, in a sense, the leading rogue state in the world today.
It is a shame that we have to admit such a thing, especially on a July 4th, when not just Americans, I would say that even as a Canadian, I celebrate the Declaration of Independence, because it is such a pivotal document in human history, dating back thousands of years. And the Constitution of the United States, a sublime document in its creation and its crafting of a nation that has stood the test of time. But from that time, 247 years ago to today, how the mighty have fallen. Look at the United States today, and as you say, it may be a rogue state. It's quite a shame, and it's something to be not only attacked, and we should confront this as we're doing right now, but it should be lamented. It's sad. Look at our impression. Like I said, it was rose tinted through Hollywood and through television shows and even through the media. I mean, the news media at the time was a little sanitized, and I'm sure it's not a true reflection of reality as it was, but it was close. And you know, for that to go from that rose-tinted view of an idealistic society and an ideal politically and philosophically of individual rights and inalienable rights to what we have today, which is warmongering, leaders who are more children than they are men. It just speaks volumes to the decay of the Western culture, doesn't it?
Precisely, and if you look back, I mean, we are looking back 60 years, and in these 60 years, what and how things change in terms of the great issues of our time: war and peace, freedom based upon individual right, constitutional government, you know, rule based in law, one law for all, you know. These things have all been in some ways been derailed, been corrupted, you know, the sanctity of election, the trust in the institutions of government, you know, all of this now has been exposed as corrupt, and as part of what President Trump called out, the swamp, the deep state and the swamp, okay? So to understand where we have arrived, it is necessary to have a picture of where we were at some point in time from where we have departed. And Kennedy was, in that sense, the pivotal moment. His killing was the pivotal moment in not only American history, but in the history, if you take the language of the Americans at that time, in the history of the free world, because the other half of the world was under, that is Soviet Union, and then China was under the communists. So the free world. Well, Canada was part of the free world. We were at the center of the free world, in the sense, at the closest ally of the United States, because we share the longest border with the United States, you know, the 49th parallel on the same continent. And I would therefore say that if Kennedy had lived and Kennedy had succeeded in his second term to implement his vision of nuclear disarmament and ending the Cold War and smashing into smithereens the CIA in 1,000 pieces, and casting it aside and ending the sort of secrecy and make the government transparent, you know, which is what he was working toward, we would not have had a war in Vietnam. And then all the subsequent events that has happened, we would not have happened what has taken place in the Middle East. It is quite possible that Kennedy would have prevailed in some ways in stopping nuclear proliferation, beginning with Israel. And we would be in a different world. The death, that is the murder of Kennedy, in effect, was the victory of the deep state. And there we have it. Not only it was the loss of America to the deep state, but it is the loss of the entire free world, the collective West we talk about. Just think about it. All the leaders in Europe, that is part of the European Union today, NATO today, there is not one single leader that stand out in terms of a De Gaulle. Again, the same generation, World War II, you know, a leader, you know, not one, you know. He was a nationalist. He was a proud Frenchman, you know, and he defended his country. De Gaulle talked about it, not Churchill, not any of the British leaders. It was De Gaulle talked about one Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals. What does that mean, Urals? That means Russia, that means Soviet Union. That Russia is part of Europe, is bound up with European history, and similarly, as President Kennedy was talking about it. So with the end of the Cold War, if that could have happened, Cold War did end. Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But if the Cold War had been brought to an end in a manner in which Kennedy visualized through nuclear disarmament, peaceful coexistence, reaching out to the Russian people, and empathy and understanding of Russian history, we would not be in the mess that we are in today, inching towards possibly another conflict that could escalate. It is a conflict going on, but a conflict into a nuclear conflict that could escalate very much into what was the horror of the Cuban Missile Crisis, And now we have nuclear proliferation in which there are about 8 or 9 countries armed with nuclear weapons, and other countries who try to get themselves armed. Country like Saudi Arabia, Iran, of course, is trying to get the nuclear weapon. Turkey, maybe South Korea, under the threat of the North Koreans. So nuclear proliferation makes the danger, the peril of a nuclear war that much more, closer to a reality than what was when there was only nuclear weapon, as during the Cuban Missile Crisis with United States and Soviet Union, and as Oppenheimer talked about it, you are like 2 scorpions in a bottle. If you want to take each other out, you're basically taking both of us out. You cannot survive alone. You have to survive together. And that's what Kennedy was saying. This is the peace that I'm talking about, is of rational men. It's a necessary peace of rational men dealing with man-made problem that we can together work and bring it to an end.
There was a part of his speech that struck me as well, and that is his realistic understanding of how things change politically, because they can change in 24 hours. Like you said, it could be all destroyed in 24 hours. But what he said was that we need an evolution, not an evolution of human nature, which is what the communist fascists try to do. They try to not recognize what human nature is and try to change it. He says, but we need a gradual evolution of our human institutions.
Exactly.
A gradual evolution of human institutions. And that is exactly what has happened. But unfortunately, it's not been an evolution. It's been a devolution. Since Kennedy's speech, incrementally, as you said, inch by inch, in the last 60 years, the spirit of 76, the glory that was the United States at that time, has devolved, as has every other country in the Western world, I think, especially Canada. Canada is not the Canada I was born into. Yes. But Salim, I thank you for this. This has been a fascinating discussion about a very pivotal man in history, and a great speech by such a man. And I can only hope that people visit that speech. It's available online. CPAC has it as well. And the text is out there, and have a look at it, analyze it. And I think you'll understand that John F. Kennedy, yeah, he's a Democrat. That doesn't mean anything anymore. A Democrat. Can you compare a Democrat Joe Biden to a Democrat John F. Kennedy? Chalk and cheese. It's not the same thing. Robert F. Kennedy holds promise, though I disagree with him on so many things, but he's at least an honest man, I think, and a man of integrity. So Salim, thank you very much. Did you want to end off with anything else?
No, I just wanted to emphasize John F. Kennedy, you was a Democrat. It could be Donald Trump is a Republican, but most important, John F. Kennedy was a patriot, a war hero, a man who grew in office and understood the reality of the world and the place of America in it, and the place of Soviet Union at that time in it, and similarly of others, other countries, China, India, the African countries that was becoming independent. So in so many ways, he was so far ahead of his time, and the evil forces in America, which could still be contained, was let loose after President Kennedy was murdered.
Yeah, what a shame. Thank you, Salim.
Thank you.